And yet, all he says in the midst of all that ruckus, he says, you say. Mark 15, 1 through 15 is a notable and powerful passage. Many scholars believe this to be the pinnacle of the Passion narrative. This is where it began. You want to know about the Easter story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? You can't start without this story right here. And what I'm doing is I'm picking up where Pastor Aaron brilliantly left off last week. Jesus was arrested by the Jewish officers in Gethsemane. And he was brought to a Jewish council called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was essentially a Jewish court filled with 70 Jewish leaders that served as essentially judges. And they found Jesus guilty of blasphemy. And for good reason. They literally asked him, "Are you the Messiah?" And his response, unapologetically, as Pastor Aaron stated, he said, "I am." It was clear. And so the Sanhedrin found him guilty and sentenced Jesus to death. And so it says, and this is where we get to, they brought him to Pilate. Now, one thing you have to know about the cultural context is this. They are in Judea. Judea is a province. And for the Americans, province is a region, maybe it's like a state, but Judea is a province. And in the province of Judea, there's a city that we all know called Jerusalem. And so they were taking Jesus to Jerusalem to come before Pilate. Now, what you have to know about Judea is that it was a prominently Jewish society. They even had their own Jewish code, their laws, their rituals, their leaders, their own court system with the Sanhedrin. But what we also have to know is that still at the end of the day, Judea, including Jerusalem, was under the Roman occupation. It was under the Roman Empire. And so while the Jewish Sanhedrin could find people guilty of charges and even have some of their own disciplinary, they could not carry out capital punishment. They could not sentence people to the death penalty. It was much more of a recommendation than it was a sentencing. So that's why they took Jesus. Okay, we have to take Jesus to Pilate, and Pilate was the governor of the province of Judea. And so he was a prefect. In other words, he was a governor. And so that's why they had to bring Jesus to the governor of Judea. And then in verse 2 of chapter 15, Pilate asks, "Are you," they bring him to Jesus, and Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, this word "you" in the original, the Bible is written in Greek, but the original language, there is a emphasis. It's an emphatic "you." So it was actually meant to be condescending. It was meant to be sarcastic. And so imagine Pilate is saying essentially in front of Jesus, "You are the one that they call King of the Jews?" And it was laughable to him because when you start using the word king, now you have turned everything political and powerful and questions about authority and who's in charge. And he looks at Jesus and he said, you're the king? And because what happened just prior to this, up until chapter 15, our verses, is that all the claims and accusations about Jesus was very religious in nature. He was guilty by the Sanhedrin for religious claims. He claimed that he can forgive sins. He claimed that he was the Son of God. He claimed that he was the Messiah. He claimed that he was the healer. And to the Jewish leaders and authorities, that was blasphemy. But the reality is, the Roman Empire, they didn't care about that. They didn't care about religious matters. They only cared about what they thought would be threatening to the Roman government. And so Mark is less descriptive as Luke, the writer, because Luke gives us detail that the Jewish leaders and authorities, they came up to Pilate and they gave him all these lies and accusations about the fact that Jesus was a threat to the Roman occupation, that Jesus was committing treason, that Jesus was considering himself a king of the Jews. It wasn't just a religious matter. Now that's become political. Now this whole scenario has become extremely politically charged. Now Pilate's paying attention because he thinks Jesus is going to be some kind of threat to the Roman government. And I love how Jesus responds to Pilate's question. He says simply, and in the English Bible you might say that Jesus replied with, what you say is right. Or, you said those words, not me. But in the original language, there's only two words. And Jesus' response simply is, in the Greek, I'll translate it, you say. You say. Now you have to understand the situation here. Pilate is accusing Jesus of treason. Everyone else, all the Jewish authorities and leaders, are hurling insults and lies about what Jesus said or what he didn't say. And literally at this moment in time, Jesus' life is dependent on a defense. For Jesus to say, I didn't say that, that's a lie, they're lying. I'm not committing treason. I'm not a threat to the Roman Empire. I'm not this, I am not that. It was an opportunity for him to fight back, to be defensive, and to plead his case. He says, you say. And if you have the NIV or the Bible where Jesus' words are in red, all the letters are in black and all these accusations, all these things, and you see two letters or two words in red, you say. And this is really, really, really important because he doesn't say yes, but he doesn't say no to the accusations. He leaves it intentionally ambiguous. He's saying basically, yes, I am the king of the Jews, but not in the way you think. And I love how Tim Keller describes this scenario. Tim Keller says that Jesus basically said, I am and I'm not. Yeah, that clears things up, right? But what's happening is that Jesus transcends even the very question. The question is an earthly question. The question has to do with politics and the government and who's in charge and who's in authority here in the Roman Empire. And Jesus responds in a way that transcends all understanding because he's not speaking of earthly powers. And he says, you say. And in response, Pilate, it says that in verse 5, that Pilate was amazed. Amazed. Because Jesus wasn't getting defensive. Jesus wasn't pleading his case, even though he should have. I bet Pilate was like, what are you doing? You should be defending yourself. And yet, because Jesus only responded with two words, it says that Pilate was amazed. Now, the word amazed, again, going back to the original language to give us a better understanding of what was happening, is the word thaumatzo. The word amazed is the word thaumatzo, and what thaumatzo means literally is to be astonished, marveled, and or in wonder. Pilate was like, what is happening? Because at the same time, it's clear that Pilate does not buy the accusations. He really doesn't. He knew that this was much more about jealousy, as the text said, than it was about legality. But the reality is, Pilate, he doesn't have the courage to stand up as a leader to do the right thing. Pilate is actually playing really good politics by appeasing the Jewish authorities, by not making the crowd angry. But Pilate did devise a plan because he felt like he had an out. And the out was this. There was a custom that during the Passover that the Roman Empire would release one prisoner to the Jewish people. And it says that in verse 7, there was a man named Barabbas who was in prison with fellow, so he was one of them, rebels who had committed murder and during the insurrection. So these were actually people legitimately committing treason, trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. And many scholars believe that Pilate grabbed the worst of the worst. He grabbed the worst of the bunch, because surely as he brings up Barabbas, the murderer, and Jesus to his other side and says, okay, who do you want to release? Pilate wanted them to say Jesus, because that was his way of doing the right thing without ticking anybody off. He was playing really good politics. Little did he know that the plan backfired, because the people yelled, release Barabbas. Release essentially this killer, this murderer, this thief, this criminal. Release Barabbas. And then he says, what should we do to this man named Jesus then? And they say, crucify him. They say, crucify him. And in verse 14, Pilate asks again, why? What evil has he done? It's clear that Pilate doesn't buy it. He has his doubts. And the crowd doesn't answer. The crowd just continues to say, crucify Jesus. And then in verse 15, it says that he wished to satisfy the crowd. And so he led him to be flogged, scourged, then crucified. And this word that is used where he wished to satisfy the crowd, the word satisfies, the word hikanos. And in the original, it has much more to do with worthiness and adequacy. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to be worthy in the eyes of the public. He wanted to seem adequate as a leader of Rome.